In March 2020, the United States lost 22 million jobs in 8 weeks. Not spread across the year, not gradually, but concentrated in 2 months, making it one of the fastest labor market contractions in modern recorded history. 2 categories of households went through that event. One had a buffer between their income and their essential expenses, even a small one. The other had nothing between their paycheck and their rent. The category with the buffer made difficult adjustments. The category without it entered a debt spiral that for many households lasted well beyond the point when the crisis itself was declared over. The deciding variable was not investment sophistication. It was not income level. It was structural preparation, specifically whether a basic financial structure had been built before the disruption arrived. What that debt spiral looked like in documented terms is specific. When income dropped and there was no savings to absorb the first shock, the expense went onto a credit card. The credit card balance carried interest. The minimum payment on that balance consumed a portion of reduced income that was now unavailable for the next expense. When the next expense arrived, it also went on the card. The balance compounded. By the time the crisis resolved and income stabilized, the household had converted a temporary income disruption into a fixed monthly obligation that would follow them for years. Federal Reserve consumer credit data shows this pattern precisely across the 2020 window. The crisis ended in months. The balance did not. The gap between those 2 outcomes was not investment strategy, sector allocation, or portfolio rebalancing. That content exists, and it is useful for someone who already has a portfolio to protect. The person with less than $10,000 in savings entering a recession is not choosing between portfolio strategies. They are choosing between a financial structure that can absorb a shock and one that cannot. Those are different problems. The portfolio question becomes relevant once the foundation is in place. Before it is in place, it is the wrong question, not because it is unimportant, but because it requires a precondition that has not yet been built. If this is the financial conversation you have been looking for, the one that starts where you actually are, not where the industry assumes you should be, subscribe to this channel. This is what they should have taught in school and never did. Almost every piece of crisis financial content published in the last 20 years was written for someone who already had something to protect. Diversify your assets, rebalance toward bonds, move to defensive sectors, increase your allocation to alternative stores of value. These are legitimate recommendations, and every single one of them assumes a starting position of existing capital. For the majority of American households, that assumption does not hold. Federal Reserve data consistently shows that close to half of American households could not cover a significant unexpected expense from savings alone. That majority has no crisis plan, not because no one cares, but because no one built one for their starting position. This video is that plan. What does crisis preparation actually look like when the starting position is limited, not in theory, but in practice, with $5,000 or $7,000 or $9,000 in a checking account facing a recession that has begun reducing income in your sector? The answer is not a scaled-down version of portfolio management. The answer is a specific sequence of structural decisions, each one creating the conditions for the next one to work. The sequence matters as much as the individual steps. Step 5 does nothing if Step 1 was skipped. Step 3 fails under pressure if Step 2 is still unresolved. The order is not arbitrary, it is load-bearing. Buffett did not begin his investment career with capital. He began it with structure. Before he placed his first significant investment, he had established the practice of holding more cash than he needed, eliminating obligations that would force him to sell at the wrong time, and building income from more than one source. When he was in his early 20s and had saved his first $10,000, earned from delivering newspapers, running small businesses, filing taxes for neighbors, The principle he applied was not find the best stock. It was build the foundation that allows you to hold the best stock when everyone else is being forced to sell. The foundation came before the investment decision. That ordering was not a phase he moved past. It was a permanent feature of how he operated. The objection that arrives at this point is predictable. You need to be investing, not sitting on cash. The response is direct. The goal of investing is to build wealth over time, and the precondition for that to work is that you do not liquidate under pressure. A $5,000 index fund position that you are forced to sell at a 30% loss during a crisis because there is no buffer does not build wealth. It destroys it. The buffer is not the opposite of investing. The buffer is what makes investing survivable. It is the structural requirement that allows the position to stay open during the months when the market gives people reasons to close it. These 6 steps are sequential. Each one creates a condition the next one depends on. They are not a portfolio strategy. They are a crisis survival structure built specifically for someone with less than $10,000 in savings, designed to hold under the pressure of a real income disruption in the order that makes each piece structurally sound before the next one is added. The sequence starts at the foundation. Without the foundation in place, the structure above it does not survive the first significant test. If this is landing for you right now, write in the comments, "I am building the foundation." That is exactly what this is. Among households that turned to payday loans or high-cost credit products during the 2020 disruption, the median liquid savings balance immediately before the disruption was under $300. Not 3,000, 300. Step 1 is the $1,000 emergency buffer held in a separate account from your primary checking. The mechanism is straightforward. When an unexpected expense arrives, car repair, medical bill, failed appliance, you pay it from the buffer, not from a credit card at 24% interest. The difference between those two choices is not the dollar amount of the expense. It is whether that expense begins compounding against you or whether it absorbs cleanly and leaves your financial structure intact. One path costs nothing beyond the original expense. The other starts a chain. The separation is structural, not just psychological, though it works on both levels. An emergency fund in the same checking account as your operating money will be spent, not because of poor discipline, but because the brain does not experience earmarked cash as meaningfully different from available cash when an urgent expense appears and the balance is positive. A separate account at a different institution with a small friction to access holds differently in practice. It signals that the money has a specific purpose. Major online banks currently offer 4 to 5% annually with no minimum balance and no monthly fees. $1,000 in that account earns $40 to $50 per year. More importantly, it does not carry 24% interest in the other direction when it gets used. Look, the path to $1,000 is more accessible than most people at this savings level believe. The question is not how to save $1,000 over the next year. The question is, how much is transferable in the next 48 hours without disrupting the next 30 days of essential expenses? For most households at this level, that number is somewhere between $100 and $500. That is not the target. That is the proof of mechanism, the demonstration that a separate account exists and that moving money into it deliberately is something you are capable of doing today. The goal is $1,000. The action available right now is the first transfer. A $5,000 credit card balance at 24.7% annual interest costs, approximately $1,235 in guaranteed interest charges over a single calendar year. Guaranteed, not contingent on market performance, not variable based on economic conditions. Step 2 is eliminating high-interest debt before the crisis makes it worse. The mechanism is a straightforward mathematical fact. Paying off debt at 24.7% is a guaranteed 24.7% return on that capital. There is no investment available to a retail investor with less than $10,000 that reliably matches a guaranteed 24% return. The highest growth asset in any portfolio does not offer a guarantee. Paying down this debt does. Pay attention to this, because it is the detail that changes how urgent step 2 becomes. In a normal economic environment, carrying high-interest debt is expensive. During a recession, it becomes structurally dangerous. When income drops by 20% for 4 months, close to the median income disruption in the 2020 recession, the monthly minimum payment on that balance does not drop. It stays fixed. It now represents a larger share of reduced income. The household that entered the crisis carrying $4,000 in credit card debt exits it with more debt, higher minimum payments, and a reduced financial margin that persists long after income stabilizes. The debt that was manageable before the disruption becomes the anchor that prevents recovery after it. If this is reframing how you think about debt versus saving, let me know by liking this video. It helps more people find this content when they need it. The question that arrives here is about sequence. Which comes first, the emergency buffer or the debt payoff? Standard financial advice splits on this, and both sides have legitimate math behind them. The practical answer for crisis preparation is the buffer first. Not because the buffer earns more than the debt costs. It does not. Because without the buffer, the first unexpected expense after you begin paying down the debt will simply put the debt back. You pay $200 off the balance, the car needs a repair, and $240 goes back on the card. The buffer is what makes the debt reduction hold. Without it, you're paying down a balance that refills every time something goes wrong. The sequence has to go in this order for the math to actually work. In the 6-week window between February 20th and April 1st, 2020, the S&P 500 dropped approximately 34%. Investors who held volatile assets and were simultaneously facing an income disruption sold at the worst possible moment because they had no other option. Not because they panicked irrationally, but because the income drop and the absence of any buffer left them with no alternative source of funds. Step 3 is having the right asset allocation for your specific savings level. The mechanism is this. At less than $10,000 in savings, the primary function of that capital is not growth. It is liquidity, the ability to access it without a loss in the month you actually need it. That function is worth more than the marginal additional return a more aggressive allocation might generate over a decade. What right allocation looks like at this level has a specific structure. The $1,000 emergency buffer is in a high-yield savings account, liquid, insured, earning 4 to 5%. The capital directed at debt reduction goes toward the highest rate balance first. Whatever remains above daily operating needs, if anything, goes into a broad, low-cost index fund with a genuine long-time horizon, meaning you have committed not to touch that position for 5 years minimum, regardless of what the market does. That commitment is only possible if the buffer and debt structure are already in place. Without them, the commitment breaks the first time income drops, and the index fund becomes the only available source of emergency cash. Now here is something worth sitting with. The compounding math for an index fund over 30 years is real. $10,000 at 10% annually becomes $174,000. But that math only applies if the position stays open. A $10,000 position liquidated at a 30% loss in year 2 because no buffer existed, and an income disruption forced the sale produces $7,000. The 30-year compounding clock starts over from a lower base, if it starts over at all. The return rate matters. Staying invested long enough for the rate to apply matters more. The buffer is what makes that duration possible. Compounding without the structural condition to remain invested is just a number on a chart. During the crisis window of early 2020, gold appreciated approximately 18%, while the S&P 500 was near its low point. 7 to 10 ounces of silver at current prices represents a position of between $200 and $300. Step 4 is a small physical precious metals position, specifically small, specifically physical. The mechanism here is insurance, not investment. Insurance does not compound. It does not generate returns in calm periods. What insurance does is hold value during the specific conditions: currency stress, financial system disruption, confidence collapse, when the assets it protects against are under the most pressure. At $200 to $300, the position is sized to function as insurance. At that size, you are not making a directional bet on precious metals. You are acquiring a specific kind of protection for a specific kind of scenario. If you have been working through this and the gap between understanding the structure and actually building it still feels like the hard part, there is something in the first pinned comment for people who are ready to close that gap. Check it when you finish here. Physical silver at this allocation size makes more practical sense than an exchange-traded fund-tracking metal prices. A $200 position in a silver ETF adds a management expense ratio, requires a brokerage account to hold, and can theoretically become inaccessible during the precise systemic conditions that make the position most valuable. $200 in physical silver coins held at home is accessible under any market conditions, carries no counterparty risk, and requires no ongoing maintenance. The objection that physical coins are harder to liquidate is accurate and largely irrelevant for a position of this size. The exit mechanism for a $200 position is not the priority. The entry mechanism is. The point is to have it before the scenario in which it matters. This is the part most people skip. What this position is not: a meaningful inflation hedge, a significant store of long-term wealth, or a primary financial strategy. At $200 to $300, precious metals cannot perform any of those functions at a scale that matters. The people who position precious metals as a core financial approach are either working with significantly larger positions or overstating what the asset class can do. At this specific allocation, the position does one thing. It holds value in a form that does not depend on financial system functioning. That is a narrow use case. It is also exactly the use case relevant to someone with limited savings, facing a systemic disruption. Size the position to match the function you actually need from it. In every recession documented since 1980, the steepest wave of job losses in the bottom 2 income quartiles concentrated within the first 60 to 90 days following the official recession declaration. Not at the start, not at the end. In that specific early window, households that had begun building any secondary income source more than 6 months before that window entered it with a different structure, even when the secondary income was modest. Step 5 is starting to build additional income before the crisis arrives. The mechanism is lead time. A secondary income stream cannot be established in the first month of a recession. The available gig work is suddenly competing with everyone else recently laid off. The client list takes months to build. The platform account with existing reviews captures the available demand first. The person who started 6 months earlier is inside the window. The person who starts when the announcement comes is not. Honestly, at this savings level, additional income does not mean passive income. That concept requires upfront capital or time that this position cannot absorb right now. It does not mean a full second job with its scheduling complexity. It means a service performed on weekends or evenings using existing skills, delivering value to someone who will pay for it within 30 days. Lawn care, cleaning, repairs, bookkeeping, delivery work, tutoring, basic design, freelance writing, whatever the specific skill set supports. The target is not to replace primary income. It is to have a second source that produces $300 to $500 per month before the crisis tightens the labor market and that window closes. The $300 to $500 figure is a crisis math number, not a financial planning target. During a 4-month period where primary income drops 25%, $300 per month from a secondary source represents the difference between drawing on the emergency buffer and having it partially replenished versus drawing on it until it runs out. Research on household financial resilience during 2020 consistently found that households with any secondary income source, even a modest one, showed meaningfully better outcomes than single-income households at equivalent primary income levels. The amount mattered less than the structural fact of the second source existing. Even a small income stream that continues during a disruption changes what the rest of the structure has to absorb. Munger had a framework he applied to almost every situation. Show me the incentive structure, and I will show you the outcome. During a recession, the incentive structure of the labor market shifts in a specific direction. Employers reduce hours before they reduce headcount. They reduce headcount before they post new positions. They post new positions long after recovery has stabilized. For someone who begins looking for additional income in month 2 of a recession, every stage of that sequence is working against them. The neighbor who started the weekend service business the previous spring already has returning clients. The freelance pipeline takes 90 days to build under normal conditions. The platform with existing reviews captures available demand first. The person who started earlier is not more talented. They are simply inside the window. In the 12 months following the market bottom in March 2009, the S&P 500 returned approximately 68%. The investors who held their positions through the decline captured that return. Data on retail investor behavior from the same period shows that a significant portion of small investors had liquidated their positions in late 2008 and early 2009, in the months just before and during the recovery. They locked in the loss. They missed the return. Step 6 is knowing exactly what not to do when the panic starts, because the 3 specific prohibitions that follow are responsible for most of the permanent financial damage small investors experience during crisis windows. Not temporary setbacks, permanent outcomes locked in at the worst possible moment. Do not liquidate the small investment position in a panic. If the index fund position established in Step 3 drops 30% during a recession, the position is worth less on paper. It is not worth less permanently unless it gets sold. A paper loss is not a realized loss. It is a number on a screen representing shares you still own in companies that are still operating. The S&P 500 has recovered from every drawdown in its history. The average time from peak to full recovery across major drawdowns since 1950 is approximately 2 years. A 30% paper loss that recovers in 24 months costs nothing except the psychological difficulty of watching the number decline. Selling it converts that difficulty into a permanent financial outcome at exactly the worst moment. Do not make speculative bets to recover faster. The pattern is consistent across crisis periods. Investors who took losses in the initial downturn attempt to recover by concentrating into higher risk positions. Individual stocks with large recent declines, leveraged instruments, options. The logic feels sound. A large gain in a single position can offset the previous loss more quickly than holding an index fund. The data on outcomes for this approach is not encouraging. Concentrated speculative positions during crisis recovery periods produce a bimodal result. Occasionally they work and the investor recovers. More frequently, they decline further, and the investor's position after the crisis is substantially worse than it was at the bottom. The variance is high, the average outcome is negative. Do not use credit card debt to invest. This sounds obviously wrong and happens anyway, documented across multiple crisis periods in behavioral finance research. The recession is several months old. Certain assets have dropped significantly. The word opportunity appears in financial media. $4,000 is available on a credit card at 24% interest. The math feels possible. If the asset recovers 50%, you repay the credit card and keep the difference. That math requires the asset to recover, requires it to recover faster than 24% annual interest compounds, requires income to stay stable throughout, requires the timing on entry and exit to be correct. All of those conditions must hold simultaneously. One failure changes the outcome entirely. None of them are guaranteed. Consider what the same 12-month crisis does to two households that begin in an identical position. Both have $7,000 in savings. Both face a 4-month income disruption that reduces household income by 25%. Household A, savings in a regular checking account, $3,000 in credit card debt, no emergency fund separation, no secondary income, and a portion of savings in a volatile asset that drops 40% by month 3. Household B, $1,000 moved to a separate high-yield savings account, $2,000 applied toward eliminating the highest rate credit card balance, the remaining $4,000 in a broad index fund with a genuine long-term commitment, and $250 per month in secondary income established 8 months earlier. Month 4 for Household A. Income drops 25%. The volatile asset is now worth significantly less. Essential expenses require drawing from the checking account. The credit card minimum payment takes an increasing share of reduced income. By month 6, the checking account balance is critically low and the credit card balance has grown because minimum payments have stopped covering the interest charges. The volatile asset gets sold to prevent further paper losses. The loss is now permanent. At the end of 12 months, Household A holds less capital than they started with, carries more debt than they started with, and has a minimum payment obligation that will follow them for years beyond the crisis. Month 4 for Household B. Income drops 25%. The emergency buffer absorbs the gap for the first month without touching the index fund or adding to any credit balance. The reduced debt service from eliminating the highest rate balance earlier in the year frees up meaningful monthly cash flow. The secondary income continues at $250 per month, regardless of what happens with the primary employer. The index fund is untouched. By month 12, the emergency buffer has been partially rebuilt. The index fund has recovered much of its paper loss, and Household B exits the crisis in approximately the same financial position they entered it. Given what happened to Household A over the same period, that outcome is something worth understanding clearly. The difference in those outcomes was not income. Both households had the same income before the disruption and the same reduction during it. It was not luck, timing, or financial sophistication. It was the structural decisions made in the months before the disruption arrived, decisions that cost nothing except time and the discipline to act on them before any urgency existed. Household B was not smarter. They were earlier. They built the structure when building it was straightforward, which meant they did not have to rebuild it under pressure. That is the core of what these 6 steps are about. Build the structure before you need it, in the sequence that makes each piece support the next. Buffett's first rule, never lose money, is typically understood as advice for managing a substantial portfolio. Applied to a position of less than $10,000 in savings, it carries more force, not less. A $500,000 portfolio that loses 10% in a downturn has $450,000. With normal contributions and market recovery, it rebuilds in 1 to 2 years. A $7,000 savings balance that loses 50% through panic selling, forced liquidation, or a speculative decision has $3,500. The practical difficulty of rebuilding from $3,500 to the original $7,000 and then continuing from there is measured in years. The first rule matters most when the margin for error is at its smallest. At this savings level, the margin for error is very small. The next 48 hours have one action in them, not a plan, not a commitment to change something over time, but one specific transfer. If a separate high-yield savings account does not exist at a different institution from your primary checking, open one. Major online banks currently offer 4 to 5% annually with no minimum balance and no monthly fees. Transfer whatever amount does not disrupt the next 30 days of essential expenses. Even if that number is $100, that is not the emergency fund, that is the proof that the mechanism works. It demonstrates that a purpose-specific account exists and that moving money into it deliberately is something you are capable of doing today. The target is $1,000. The action available in the next 48 hours is the first transfer. Something in you already knows the distance between understanding this and actually doing it. You have encountered financial content before and felt the clarity of a good explanation without changing anything about the week that followed. That gap is not a character flaw. It is the ordinary pattern of how behavioral change works. The step that matters is not the plan. It is the first action that costs something real, a small friction, a decision, 4 minutes and a login, and happens anyway. Every structural change in your financial life that has ever mattered started with something that felt smaller than the problem it was addressing. The transfer is that action. It is the right size for where you actually are right now. The lead time is the whole game. None of the 6 steps in this video can be built in month 2 of a recession. The emergency buffer takes weeks to fund adequately. The debt reduction takes months to meaningfully change the minimum payment structure. The secondary income requires 3 to 6 months to establish before it produces reliable cash flow. The asset reallocation needs time to implement thoughtfully. The metals position needs to be acquired before a crisis drives retail premium prices up. None of these steps are available to someone who begins when the announcement comes. They are available to someone who begins on a Tuesday when nothing is urgent and the crisis is still theoretical. That Tuesday is the window. That window is now. The financial system was not designed for the starting position described in this video. It assumes existing capital. It assumes a portfolio that needs managing, accounts that need optimizing, assets that need rebalancing. The advice built on those assumptions is not wrong. It is out of sequence for someone who has not yet built the foundation that the advice requires. These 6 steps are not a simplified version of portfolio management. They are a separate category of financial decision-making, specific to the vulnerability of limited savings facing a large economic disruption. The goal of implementing all 6 is not to become wealthy. It is to not be financially destroyed by something that affects everyone, and to come out the other side with the structure intact and ready to build on. Buffett's path from his first $10,000 to what he eventually built was not a straight line of compounding returns. It was a series of structural decisions that preserved capital during the moments when most of his contemporaries lost it. Through market corrections, recessions, and the periodic events that eliminate investors who had not built the foundation first. He held more cash than he needed before he needed it. He eliminated obligations that would force selling at the wrong time before the wrong time arrived. He built income from multiple sources before his primary source was ever at risk. By the time he made the investments that defined his legacy, the structure protecting them was already decades old. The foundation is not the preliminary step before the real work begins. The foundation is what makes everything that follows possible. 6 months from today, the person who implemented these steps in sequence will face whatever economic environment arrives from a fundamentally different position, not immune to disruption, not insulated from all of its effects, but structurally capable of absorbing the first shock without converting it into a debt spiral. That is a narrow outcome in the language of financial planning. In practice, it is the difference between a disruption that costs some difficult adjustments and a disruption that costs years. The window for building this on your own terms, at a pace that works, without the pressure of an income disruption already in progress, that window is now. The structure that survives a crisis has to be built before the crisis declares itself. If you stayed until the end, write in the comments, "I start with what I have." There is another video on your screen right now, the next step in understanding how money really works. Thank you for watching. We will see you in the next one.